change of society in all spheres because of this technology, and I'm supposed to know something about that, something about economic change and technological change and its implications. Of course, we don't know the answers to most of the good questions that will be asked and most of the questions that are on your mind, but I'll try to say something useful and I hope interesting about various aspects of artificial intelligence and its implications in at least 3 domains. One is AI and global problem solving on some of the big challenges that we face, especially what I work on day in and day out, sustainable development and climate change. We have some major global challenges, and in a way AI is coming, and not just AI, but the digital revolution coming at a moment when we really need it. The capacities of these new technologies to help address some of the critical problems are clear and absolutely desperately needed. A second issue that I want to discuss briefly, and then we'll have some time for deeper discussion, is the implications of the technological change on our economies. And partly the first topic of problem solving is obviously economically related, but I think all of us are wondering about what will happen to economic life as these technologies continue to improve and substitute for human labor. So the question of the future of work, the future of jobs, income distribution, and whether we have a utopian or dystopian future from superintelligence and so forth is obviously on our mind. And I think we can say some things, even at this stage, analytically about what might occur. And the third topic I want to talk about is foreign policy, because these technologies will change foreign policy and will change safety in the world, and probably not in a wholly beneficent way. We know with almost every technological change, there is pretty quickly a militarization of technologies. This is a technology that is absolutely able to spread very widely. It has a lot of offensive capabilities in geopolitical and military terms. It's deeply problematic, and I want to say a few words about that as well. It's fun to be in this room surrounded by a lot of great people that are in these portraits along the walls. Rather inspiring to have Ohm and Ampere and Maxwell and Kelvin looking at you as you talk. But I think it is also a good reminder that it is what these gentlemen brought about, actually, that more than any other force in history has changed the world so fundamentally and dramatically. And it's a good backdrop for any discussion of AI, the fact that we are in one of the most remarkable technological revolutions in history. And what we know from each wave of technological change is that the implications are very deep, not well understood, profoundly difficult often, because changes like the ones that we're considering with the digital revolution have huge effects on income distribution, on how we live, where we live, what we do, and how states interact. And this is a revolution that also it's inspiring to have this as a part of the Turing Institute, because Alan Turing was certainly one of the greatest geniuses of modern history. Absolutely unbelievable to think how clever this gentleman was, and how persecuted he was is another lesson for us, of course, because here we have one of the most creative and greatest geniuses of all time, and he was an object of direct persecution, which also tells us something about how weird we are as a species and how liable we are to self-destruction. Well, I would like to put this revolution, which Alan Turing got started in the 1930s, as maybe the third big wave of technological change that got started really with James Watt and his very successful steam engine of the 1770s, when he improved Newcomen's steam engine, which had been brought online in 1712, separated the condenser and suddenly made an economically efficient steam engine. The world changed in a way that had not really occurred for the preceding 10,000 years. We went from the age of agriculture to the age of industry. And the steam engine, I think, deserves pride of place as the greatest invention of modern times, or the most decisive change of modern times. Probably the second great wave of change was by many of the gentlemen around this room in portraiture, and that is the age of electrification. And we have probably mostly Faraday to thank with induction and the ability to produce electricity. And we're in the Lord Kelvin Hall, and Kelvin not only discovered an incredible long list of principles of basic physics and thermodynamics, but he also helped lay the first transatlantic cable for telegraphy, and that, of course, changed history in deeply profound ways. Electrification, like the steam engine, changed the world of communication. It allowed the British Empire to reach yet another higher apogee. The fact that two great revolutions, one after another, came from England, in effect, or came from Britain to a very large extent, gave Britain a dominance in economic and military power that lasted throughout the 19th century. We were in the Pax Britannica, but no peace. So maybe POX Britannica in a lot of ways, a global empire, a lot of war, a lot of conquest, but also industrial globalization. And I think that it's right to say that the third great revolution started with Alan Turing's imagination and the idea of universal computation and all that enabled when it was combined with John von Neumann's brilliance of design, and then the semiconductor revolution, which began in World War II and soon afterwards. And each of these three great waves utterly transformed society and created both new possibilities, fundamentally economic growth without question, and also tremendous social conflict and social division, partly because each of these great waves of technology could be militarized, but also fundamentally because any great technological change involves profound changes of income distribution. And that's why in the first wave of industrialization, one could argue with Marx and Engels on one side that this was impoverishing the British working class, and among the classical economists arguing that this was the greatest takeoff of living standards that one had seen. Both were true for a while, and eventually Marx was proved basically wrong in economics because the rise of productivity lifted also wages eventually as well. though Marx was right about a lot of things on politics, I would say, and how politics works and how it's owned by a dominant class, something that we see basically until today, I think, to be true. So what is it about this digital revolution that is distinctive? First, let me say a few things about problems that it can solve in our present day, and then talk about the implications for the labor market, income distribution, economic growth, and so on. We're in a very paradoxical situation in the global economy after 2 centuries of continued economic growth. So what James Watt started and what Faraday and Kelvin continued and what Turing and von Neumann made possible and Bardeen and others, Shockley made possible afterwards, has led to 2 centuries of compound economic growth that has essentially raised living standards by, and technically measured terms, by 1 order of magnitude, and enabled global population to grow by an order of magnitude as well. In official statistics, not very meaningful, we've had about a 100-fold increase of global output since the start of the Industrial Revolution at the beginning of the 19th century or the end of the 18th century. More generally, we have filled the planet with people and with the industry that is, on the one side, responsible for an average level of output per person, which is at a level that would have been unimaginable 50 or 100 years ago. On the conventionally measured global production at so-called international prices, the average output per person on the planet for 7.6 billion people is now $18,000 per person. We've become a rich world, and that is the result of compound economic growth fundamentally driven by technological advance. So that's pretty good, and it has meant tremendous declines of poverty rates, which were 90% plus at the start of the industrial era, and now arguably are well below 10% or around 10% of the world population today, if you're talking about extreme poverty. Life expectancy has soared to 70 plus years and more than 80 years in the high income countries. We've had, and now much more, around 55% of the world population lives in urban areas, and a not small proportion of the so-called rural population actually lives in towns, in effect. So we've completely transformed life on the planet from what is very hard physical labor, which engaged almost all of humanity 2 centuries ago, to a situation where probably almost none of us in the room today had any physical exertion at work. I apologize for being presumptuous, but I certainly did not break a sweat, and almost never do, except if I'm rushing to a coffee shop. So work has become completely different for a not small part of the world. I like to say that, although my wife never likes me to say it, that we're lucky it's not even work anymore. It's interesting discussion with people in very nice settings, usually with the coffee and food abundantly around. This is the transformation that has come about for about a quarter of the world's population. And another half of the world's population has escaped from dire distress, and maybe another quarter of the population lives in a lot of physical, arduous work and continued difficulty, and 10% lives at the edge of survival day by day. So the world's become rich, but it's become quite divided. But a second phenomenon, of course, which everybody knows and appreciates, is that a 100-fold increase of production, if one can use these conventional measures, means a now unbearable physical burden on the Earth's systems. Climate change, biodiversity, fresh water, hydrologic cycle, nitrogen cycle. In almost every area that we look, we are paradoxically in this great, not quite paradoxically, but in a sense paradoxically, with all this capacity, knowledge, and technology, we're on the verge of destroying a great deal of the planet on which our survival and well-being depends. And this is the challenge that we hardly recognize in some ways, and that we have not yet been able to get under control. Wealth galore, robust economic growth, so conventionally measured, the global economy now roughly $100 trillion per year, grows 3% per year pretty reliably. World population continues to expand by about 1% per year, meaning about 80 million net population increase per year. And we're possibly destroying all of it by our inability to keep focus and attention on the fact that the burdens of greenhouse gas emissions, land transformation, water demand for food production, and so forth, and various kinds of chemical pollutants of air, water, soil, and oceans are now reaching a level that is shockingly large and potentially catastrophic. And we had a report last week, which I hope you have noted and have had a chance at least to look at a headline, but I would encourage you to read online in what's called the Summary for Policymakers, for example, of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which reported on our goal that the world set in 2015 to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius warming compared to the temperature at the time of James Watt, the pre-industrial temperature. And it said we're basically out of time to do this, that it would require a heroic effort of a global, decisive change in order to bring this about. Well, the idea of sustainable development is the idea, let's get our act together to combine average wealth with social inclusion and less inequality, and with environmental sustainability. So the idea of summarizing our global challenge as a sustainable development challenge, which is what all of the governments of the world agreed to in 2015 when they adopted Sustainable Development Goals as a shared diplomatic framework, is that with all our economic productivity and know-how, we need to move beyond what capitalism does very well, which is create economic growth, to actually a social, economic, political system that shares the wealth far more fairly around the world and within countries, and doesn't end up being suicidal from an environmental point of view. And for that, we need two things. One is we need pretty big systems change and cognitive change to understand what our real circumstances are, because we're a little bit blinded to these realities. And second, we need a technological revolution that can make it possible to combine the things we want of longevity, safety, quality of life with environmental survival and with a socially inclusive society. And this is where AI and the digital revolution, I believe, comes in as a potentially decisive, positive force for change. Because in every practical area of sustainable development, whether it's expanding access to education or expanding access to healthcare or growing crops more productively or moving to a zero carbon energy system, there's a huge role for digitization and for AI. And the applications, which I won't belabor except if we want to move to discussion, are phenomenally pervasive. They're already, of course, being demoed in many, many contexts, in smart grids, in smarter cities, in transport systems, in new education and health delivery models. But I would say that basically what the digital revolution offers is a set of solutions that are of profound importance and timeliness right now. But having said that, I want to stress, and we'll have some more chance to discuss it, a market system will not solve these problems within the logic of a market system. Markets are very useful. They create wealth. They mobilize greed. We're all greedy. We're all prone to respond to profit opportunities. But they are not good at solving problems of social inclusion and environmental sustainability per se. So there's nothing inherent in saying we have a technological solution, therefore it will be implemented, because the problems of social inclusion and environmental sustainability are not market solutions primarily. Markets can be tweaked to address them. You can put on a price of carbon, for example. It's not a bad thing to do. It's a helpful thing to do, but it won't solve the climate problem unless we get our political and social systems around the solution, not just a technical fix of, say, a tax on CO2 emissions. So we have technological capacities, but they need to be directed and harnessed as solutions on large scale to these mega challenges of our generation. Okay, let me stop there for a moment because I want to reprise that when I talk about the geopolitics in a few minutes. One of the implications of these technologies is smarter and smarter machines. Clearly, it's almost the definition of what we're after. And if it's not machines, smarter and smarter systems. And one of the things that this means is that a lot of the things we do as individuals are being done already, and many more will be done by machines rather than human beings. We're not as good as AI systems or digital systems on countless things that we have had to do as human beings throughout survival, whether it's processing, categorizing, measuring, monitoring, or physical work that now robotic systems can do. We know that machine capacity for decades already, in fact for 2 centuries I would say, has been pretty rapidly substituting for human labor. And there's a huge wave of this competition with the smart systems and machines on the way. So let me say just a few words about what that is likely to mean. Because there are 2 kinds of visions that are promulgated as a response to very smart machines. A kind of utopian vision and a kind of dystopian vision. And there is a usual response that economists give, which I don't think is a very good one, and then I'll tell you the right answer. Okay? So, one vision of the utopian vision is the machines do all the work, it's wonderful. We have a great gain of productivity. Living standards will go up, and we'll all be better off. And there's sometimes a gloss that higher productivity will raise our earnings because productivity increases tend to get into wages and salaries, and therefore we'll all be lifted by these improvements, and that's basically the story of the last 200 years. Technological revolution that lifts living standards and creates the benefits of life that I mentioned briefly earlier. There's a dystopian vision, which, by the way, was already promulgated, of course, by the Luddites, who became famous for it in the early 1800s, by Engels in 1844 in his wonderful essay on the English working class, and so on, that this will immiserize the workers for the simple reason that machines will replace workers. And that as machines replace workers, wages will fall rather than rise, people will be thrown out of work, and that what we will have is actually mass unemployment or mass underemployment of people who earn very, very little, and a kind of desperation in society, the dystopian view, or a variant of it that will all work for Jeff Bezos in the end, or 2 or 3 gazillionaires, and they are trying to add zeros and zeros and zeros and zeros to their net worth at astounding rate. Last time I checked, Bezos was up to 160 billion net worth. The market's gone down the last couple of days. He may be reduced to 155 billion this morning, but it's a lot of zeros and a lot of wealth in some hands and potential immiserization in other hands. So you have these two competing views. They're both logically consistent, by the way. Neither one can be ruled out by economic logic, in fact. It is not the case that the dystopian view is a myth and proved wrong by the last 200 years of technology. What I think is right is the following basic points. First, what's happening now with ever more productive machines and systems, whether it's the robots or the AI, is qualitatively not so different from processes that have been underway for a century of machines replacing workers. So we already have a lot of experience with this, and both of the visions that I described are only partial truths in this. So the fact of the matter is that rising productivity of machines does not lift all workers, actually. Contrary to the optimism that, well, old jobs go away, but new jobs are created and everybody is made better off, this is absolutely not the case of automation. What is the case of automation in the last 100 years is that the machines successfully replaced repetitive physical work on the assembly line or in other parts, especially of the goods-producing sectors, which means industry, agriculture, mining. And agriculture is perhaps the main example of this, where mechanization meant the basically moving from 90% farmers in the pre-industrial setting to under 3% farmers and under 1% farmers in the United States today, who create a food supply for the U.S. and for export with less than 1% of the labor force. So those jobs really were eliminated. New jobs were created, but not jobs for the same kind of skills and the same people just transferring to other occupations. The jobs that were created by and large for people with more education. And so to work with this rising productivity level is what economists call skilled biased technical change. The rise was for those who were lucky to be able to get first literacy and numeracy, and then the next cut was you needed at least a high school education, and now you need at least a bachelor's degree in a high income setting in order to really have a good chance in the labor market, unless you have some amazing particular skill in athletics or arts or something else. But basically the standard at which you compete with the machines has not remained static. And what this means also, I'll refer to the US labor market, workers of a given skill level, for example, a 9th grade education or a 12th grade education, which means below university, have seen falling living standards over the last 50 years at a time when the average incomes have soared, doubled or tripled. So it's not true that the growth just lifts everybody. In the United States and in general in most of our societies, what's happened is a huge divide between those with a bachelor's or above in the US context and a high school or even some college and below. And these are two societies now in the United States. And this division has widened over the last 40 years, and it is likely to continue to widen with this further advance, with one notable interesting point, which is that the new AI steps will replace some of the most skilled workers also. The radiologists, the people who read advanced imaging of various kinds for their job will be replaced by expert systems very quickly. But by and large, we're still eliminating jobs at the lower levels of educational attainment and skills and raising demands at the upper level. It's also true that not only is there a widening of the income inequality, but it's not true that the net job creation equals the job loss. And the reason is that with higher overall productivity, we take more leisure, retirement time, and endless adolescence, meaning that we stay in school. I never left school. I entered school in 1972. I never got out. I'm still in college. I like it. It's fun. You learn a lot. I don't know why, but they pay me, but I shouldn't say that. But in any event, we spend time now in completely different ways from 50 years ago. And one of the ways we spend time is outright leisure or staring at our screens, what's almost synonymous these days, or in formal training, or as I said, on vacation time, which is now very greatly extended. So what is the difference between the dystopian and the utopian view? It partly is, are you lucky either with your skills or with your parents to be able to get the skill training that you need? If so, the world looks pretty bright. And if not, the world looks pretty frightening. And that is a big divide in our societies right now. But a second quick point to make, and I have 2 more minutes, is that a lot of the outcome should not and need not depend on this market-determined result, because in normal civilized societies, not normal, in civilized societies, there are very few of them. But in civilized societies, governments would collect taxes from the winners and share the benefits with those who are not benefiting, so that on average, living standards could rise for everybody. So this is why this technological change requires a kind of social democratic ethos, is how I would describe it. Not an Anglo-Saxon libertarian ethos, which is, well, it's tough luck, which is the American morality right now. And that is a big question mark for our societies, whether we can keep a social ethos which says overall productivity is rising, but for some, incomes are absolutely declining in market terms. And we need to be able to give a boost so that what is true in principle is the utopian view that with enough income redistribution, with college tuition paid by the state, with other benefits, and with Jeff Bezos not having $160 billion, but much less than that, and other wealthy people being taxed on their wealth or on their holdings of equity or their ownership of the IP of these systems, that we could share the benefits more broadly. One idea, of course, is universal basic income. That's, by the way, a technical argument. There are many ways to share, and universal basic income is one that's probably not the best way to think about it. But what is the right way to think about it is that rich societies can ensure that everybody has high and even rising living standards over time. So that is a political choice. It's not going to be the market outcome. Let me turn to the third quick dimension of this, which is foreign policy and global implications. All technologies, it seems, have their positive and their negative dimensions, and their civilian applications and their militarized applications. We can't seem to do almost anything without incorporating it into more violence and more destruction. And no doubt cyber warfare and use of AI for surveillance, loss of privacy, and interstate war, space war, like my crazy president is talking about right now. Do you want him, by the way? Unbelievable how weird it is that in the 21st century, with all this wisdom, we end up with Donald Trump as president. That's a whole nother talk, but it's actually should be reflected on in these circumstances. It shows the kind of perversity of social processes. Not, by the way, completely unrelated to that second point of widening income inequality, though Trump is no answer to any of that. He's an imbecile, sorry to say, and a sociopath. But he is partly a result of those forces widening, so of that widening income inequality. So the question for me at this interstate geopolitical level is, can we cooperate globally in the same way that we need to cooperate within our societies? That's true of income inequality, because places in the world that live off of their labor toil right now, commodity exporting countries, goods exporting countries, will see a loss of the terms of trade from these technologies. And so they will have a harder time, just the same way that a young worker with only a high school degree will see a very hard time in the labor market. So there needs to be international solidarity. There also needs to be international cooperation to face mega challenges like climate change. No country can fix the climate on their own. And so we need agreements like the Paris Climate Agreement. But what is happening right now is obviously moving almost exactly in the wrong direction for the moment. We had a momentary peak of global cooperation in 2015, when in September 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted, and in December 2015, the Paris Climate Agreement was adopted, both unanimously. And now we're in a new Cold War that gets worse by the day. And this is largely US driven, unfortunately, and sane minds are preoccupied with other things like Europe falling apart, Brexit, and so forth, and we're not in a very cooperative mode right now. So, and these technologies play into it, because what is driving the US security establishment crazy, and I think it's an apt term, at least profoundly neurotic, is China's rapidly rising capacity in technology in general, but really in these technologies specifically. And this is leading the US very dangerously and very erroneously to the view that we better suppress China's development right now. We need a trade war with China. We need to block exports. We need to stop China from buying our technologies and so forth, because China now is a strategic competitor. And US foreign policy doctrine says that China is out to undermine the international system, which is absolutely false. What China is out to do is to develop, and China has the real circumstance that it has a population more than 4 times larger than the United States. So if it approaches the US in living standards even close to that, it becomes much bigger than the United States. And that's what's happening right now. And from the US point of view, that's unfair. This is the American century still. That started in 1941, and it has to last at least to 2041. That's what a century is. And somehow China is unfairly intruding in America's reality. So we're in a period of rising tension, but in my opinion, not caused by bad behavior of America's competitors, but by the vain idea that a country, my own, with 4.4% of the world's population should somehow dominate the world. Well, Britain tried that for a while also. It lasts for a while, and then it doesn't last anymore. That's good, by the way. And that's what should happen with the United States also, which should become one of many successful, prosperous regions of the world, living in peace and cooperating with the rest of the world. And that would be good. Instead, we're entering an era of potential conflict, and the acceleration of the technological revolution is exacerbating this now. My wife and I were at a security conference a couple of months ago where we heard NATO generals and American generals talk about how we're going to accelerate the introduction of AI into weapon systems, into battlefield warfare, and so forth. And you had to feel, oh my God, how stupid can this be? Because what they said is, we'll accelerate and we'll stay ahead of the rest of the world, which no, that will not happen, because the capacity of China and other countries in the world to stay at the cutting edge is absolutely real. And what they didn't talk about in this security conference was how we might not have an arms race in AI, just like we could have done without reaching 41,000 nuclear weapons in the Cold War nuclear arms race. Well, that level of intelligence has not yet come to the security establishment. And that's where we need some maybe human intelligence as well. Thank you very much. Good.
Thanks very much, Jeff, for a wonderful overview of our sustainable development challenges. We have a lot to talk about, and please don't feel that you need to pull any punches in expressing political views.
No, I'll stop being so mealy-mouthed about it.
Thank you. Maybe if it's okay, we'll go in reverse so we can remember the points you were just making, talking about China and global cooperation. I think you're very clear in noting your view that our current policies are going in the wrong direction. How can we try to go in the right direction? What should we be doing?
I think whenever you're dealing with a counterpart, whether it's an individual or in statecraft, the most important thing to do is put yourself in the position of the counterpart. And also to remember that there is no such thing as inevitable conflict or inevitable cooperation. For both game theoretic reasons, strategic reasons, as well as our human makeup, we're perfectly capable of either mode of interaction. We can become enemies or we can find cooperation. So I think with China, it's really important to understand, first of all, China had 2 bad centuries, and they don't want that to happen again. Britain was one of the agents of that, certainly one of the most remarkable wars in history, the Opium Wars. Just the whole idea of it, that we will fight you for the freedom of narcotics trade, has to rank very high in the annals of bad behavior. And it was a really bad behavior of the British Empire. But Europe behaved badly vis-a-vis China for the whole 19th century. And Japan was really nasty to China basically in the 20th century up till Japan's defeat in World War II. When you go through this kind of tumult, and then the Maoist period and the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, and you finally get your feet on the ground and you have 40 years of economic development, there are 2 truths to this. One is you're actually not out to take over the world or to destroy anything. You're happy that both feet are on the ground and you would like the chance to continue to have economic development. So what Deng Xiaoping said to the Chinese people in 1978 is absolutely both right and still believed, which is be quiet, regain your strength. And China is not out to destroy anything right now. It is not a belligerent country. It is a country that still is at 1/4 the U.S. income level, and it would like, thank you, some more decades of quiet to continue to be able to build the economy. The United States has gotten it in its head, as I said, that this is profoundly unfair for China to be developing. It is an intrusion on America's prerogatives, and some crazy people who happen to have official positions in my country seem to want to stop it right now. And if we buy Chinese goods, that's against American interests. We actually have an advisor to Trump who is crazy enough to hold this view. And also the idea that you can contain a country of 1.4 billion people is madness, by the way. So all of this is to say that if we don't provoke conflict, we would not even reach this issue for very deep reasons. And I've been going to China now for 37 years, many times a year, and have watched my generation grow up and become senior officials. I trained many of them. I've been friends with them for 30 years. This is not a hostile country. We could make it so, but that would be one of the stupidest things to do in our time. And that's the first point. Second, if we said with China we should cooperate on climate change, we should cooperate on AI, we should cooperate on a range of technologies, nanotechnology, better materials, photovoltaics, energy storage, you name it, all the list of things that are needed for a sustainable future, we would find a willing partner Instead, Trump has on his desk right now an order to stop Chinese students from American universities. You can't imagine this I can't imagine this in my country, but this is argued by Stephen Miller, one of Trump's racist, nationalist, idiot advisors. Sorry, I'll watch my language.
It's okay.
Foolish, ridiculous, absurd advisors. So we could create the bases for self-fulfilling conflict. And I'm shocked at how easy this is to occur, because frankly, 5 years ago, I would never have imagined this. But I have to say, while Trump is absolute the extreme that we've seen in the United States leadership, even a very nice, bright, well-meaning, intelligent president like Obama said, we need a trade agreement that excludes China, so we write the rules. He wanted the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. How do you announce we're going to have a trade agreement with Asian countries deliberately to leave out China because we need to write the rules? That's obnoxious, by the way. That should not be statecraft. And yet that was official statecraft of our nice president. And he is a very nice man, by the way, and a very decent man. But it shows how messed up we are, how easy it is to fall into the mode of conflict.
Thank you. So perhaps we should listen to our neighbors, and we should respect them, and we should help them achieve what's best for them, and that will help us perhaps all move towards a good solution.
Yeah, and I think Jesus was really clever, by the way, when he said, why do you point out the mote in the opposite eye when you have the beam in your own eye in the Gospels? It's actually a really smart idea, which we now call various kinds of cognitive bias and confirmation bias and so forth. But he was a great psychologist and had a great insight. And we almost never look at ourselves and say, we do the same thing. And that would help a lot if every time you had to write an op-ed, you were forced to make a list of all the horrible things your own country did before you put pen to paper. We'd actually remember a lot more, and we would find common ground a lot more easily.
I think that's a great point. Actually, going with that idea, as we think about listening to our neighbors and trying to help each other, if we look at just one of our countries, if we look either at the UK or the US, or right now, almost any developed country, we're seeing a time of unprecedented or almost unprecedented political divide and polarization. And it's interesting that it doesn't seem to have been just a very recent phenomenon. It's actually been going on for a few decades. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. You know, is AI contributing to that? Can AI help with that? Or is there something else going on?
It's interesting that I think the Brexit phenomenon and the Trump phenomenon are almost the same, actually. And sociologically, and maybe even Cambridge Analytica. So maybe even the manipulation of the political process was not only congruent, but actually the same actors. We don't really know some of what has gone on in the margins of both of these votes, which were very close, and Trump actually got less than half of the votes. But unfortunately, we didn't have your rules. We had the Electoral College and ended up with him as president. But it's a complicated phenomenon, what's happening. Certainly, if you look at the voting patterns for Brexit and Trump, there's an education gradient which is very strong. And if you rank states by proportion with a bachelor's degree, the fit on a simple bivariate linear regression explaining Trump's vote against the share of bachelors or above is a straight downward sloping line with I think, an R-squared of 0.7 or something. Don't quote me, but it's a very high fit of the line. So there's a lot that is basically sociological. There's a big, at least in the United States, but I think it's probably true in Britain also, there is an urban versus suburban and rural divide. The urban, so this is something a little bit different because it's not only education, it's another component. The urban environment, London or New York, so unbelievably diverse. And I think those of us who are residents of these great cities love the diversity, and it's part of the thrill of living in big cities. There clearly is part of society that absolutely does not like this. And there's probably been a lot of self-sorting. Where do you live? Also, what are your skills and so forth. We have a data set in the US that was created by a group of psychologists looking at the so-called Big Five personality traits, one of which is openness, which is a battery of questions on how willing to have new experience or out-group experience and so forth. And the coastal states and the urban areas are much more open in personality than the Midwest and the South. And that also is a huge explanatory variable for votes. And in a, not a bivariate regression, but adding in both of these factors of education and personality, you get an even stronger explanation. So I think, and then that comes to the question of migration and all the rest. So where does the digital revolution fit in this? I think that it has been part of a revolution of widening income inequality and widening social status that comes with a more complex technological base of society. And this income gradient is a real thing. There's no question about it. And in the United States, by the way, life expectancy of those with a college degree is rising steadily. And life expectancy, if you have a high school degree or less, is actually falling now, which is shocking in an advanced, rich society with huge technological advances. But this is another deep measure of two societies next to each other. And I think that that is part of this phenomenon. Of course, again, neither of these votes, in my opinion, has anything to do with the real prospects or better life conditions of the people who voted for Trump, for example. He's good at spending other people's money. Now he's spending the money of the American people by huge tax cuts and mega deficits, which are reaching $1 trillion a year. And we have a little boom underway right now, like most populist booms. This will run out as our public debt continues to rise. So I don't think he's doing any favors to anybody other than a tiny short-term blip of fiscal stimulus. But perhaps the perceptions in the society can be explained by these phenomena.
Good. But how can we find a way to move forward together? So presumably those folks who are fortunate to be in academia, where sometimes it doesn't even feel like work, perhaps it makes sense to try to reach out to some of these people who are taking different political views to try to understand where they're coming from and try to find some way to heal the divides.
I think one thing I always recommend is, though it's under stress also, is to look at Scandinavian experience and compare it with the Anglo-American approaches, although Britain and the US are not exactly the same in this regard. But every year I co-edit with Lord Richard Layard and Professor John Helliwell an annual report called the World Happiness Report. And every year, the top of the world happiness rankings are Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Iceland. The Nordics are always at the top. The United States has sunk to about 24th in the annual data as of last year, and the data that we report, which is a moving average, to 18th position from what was 4th position a decade or two ago. And what the Scandinavian model is, or what I call the social democratic model, was a lot of social policy so that everybody is given a benefit. And in Scandinavia, everybody gets, now, I may be wrong, but it seems like about 6 weeks vacation if you're in Sweden, because from mid-July to end of August, you can't reach anyone. They're out on their archipelago or in their boat or enjoying themselves in Stockholm or elsewhere, because everybody is guaranteed this leave time. Every mother is guaranteed basically a year's maternity leave, and every dad is guaranteed, I think, 9 months of father's leave with the newborn. Everybody has access to, all the rest of the benefits, child care, free tuition, universal health coverage, and also. This is, to my mind, the humane way to run a society. And I think it has the added virtue that people are happy. So it's not just my presumption, but it actually shows up as being very happy. Every day, the Wall Street Journal, which is our Rupert Murdoch cheat sheet, runs an absurd editorial, oh my God, if we don't cut taxes again for the rich, we'll end up like Europe. And I say, oh, please, why not? We won't shoot each other. We'll all have vacation time. It'll be very pleasant. We'll be happier. But according to the Wall Street Journal, we'll be absolutely dismal, crushed by the burden of taxation and so on. So I think that this is really where the Anglo-Saxon libertarian view, which had some merit when John Stuart Mill wrote on liberalism, it's a little worn right now. And I come from a country that thinks Ayn Rand is a philosopher. She wrote lousy books, terrible novels, but nothing related to philosophy that I can see. But she is kind of the guru of the American right wing, which is the pseudo-philosophy of selfishness, as if you really needed a philosophy to tell you to be selfish. So we need not just understanding, but we need social institutions that transfer more income, that create a base, and because of AI and the accelerating technologies and the jobs implications, we need that more than ever.
Understood. I think we may well get some questions on how that might work. But if we could just take a few minutes on your second point about the trend for more education and more skills to be needed in order to be able to do well. I want to make sure I understand, do you think that the necessary level of skills in order to be able to continue to do well is going to keep rising? So are we in a situation where, because of technological developments, particular AI, it means that to do better than what the machines can do, we're going to need to keep getting better and better, otherwise we'll get left behind?
I'm not sure, because it has been the trend for the last 100 years that the education level you need to stay still in living standards has continued to go up. And even a BA degree, of course, famously, is no guarantee of labor market success now. An advanced degree, an MBA, a master's, and so forth, it's continued to push up. And that has been the trend for at least 100 years. Remember, at one point, even an elementary education was not really necessary for work. though it was deemed a good thing to read the Bible and to be able to be a citizen, but the education level that would be the where you could keep in the race with the machines has continued to go up. It may not continue this way out of the basic logic that the machines are now moving beyond servo mechanisms and physical brawn and physical mechanization of spinning or lugging things or harvesting or weeding or mining and so forth, but to absolute cognitive capabilities that are obviously extremely sophisticated. And so one could imagine a shift of the income distribution away from all labor, including skilled labor, to the owners of intellectual property and to capital, the owners of the robots who are so good as to be able to do a much wider range of things. So it's not absolutely sure that AI means that now you need a triple advanced degree. It could stop that trend, but it is probably the case that that still we're in a world where machines and systems will substitute rather than complement labor at a given level of education, so that just standing still and expecting to be lifted up by this is probably not likely. And I would guess that the next range of jobs to be lost in this revolution is, of course, in the service sector. Well, the goods sector employment has continued to decline. In agriculture, almost gone because machines do everything. And in mining, almost all jobs, of course, have already disappeared. And probably throughout manufacturing, there'll be a continued decline of manufacturing employment, but higher productivity. Construction is increasingly being mechanized and roboticized in important ways. So there'll be continuing goods production substitution, but we're also going to see a huge swath of the service sector replaced, as is already happening, in service establishments, in retail trade, in warehousing, and in transport. And, okay, so that's another 20 or 25% of the labor force, because who needs shops other than to go in and decide what you're going to order online? So shops will become kind of museums of or opportunities to sample something, and then you'll have it delivered at home anyway from a warehouse, and the shop will be just a storefront to carry your coffee and so on. And we won't have baristas because it's already happened. We will walk into Starbucks or whatever, and our iris will be scanned, and the machine will say, "Good morning, Mr. Sachs. Will it be your regular iced coffee?" And you'll pick it up at the end of the line and won't need too much any human interaction besides talking to yourself. Or you'll be connected to someone else anyway, because everyone's got plugs in their ears now, wherever you turn. So I think that we're going to see a big continuing shakeout of that sector. Those are the last jobs where a high school degree in the United States still works. And hard to believe that that sustains itself. So I think this trend is going to continue for a while longer. But logically speaking, it isn't a necessity that what I'm saying is the only logic of the situation. If the machines become substitutes for high cognitive tasks, which they are obviously in certain ways. We don't need paralegals, and we won't need as many doctors, and we won't need as many radiologists, and we won't need as many other professions where the machines will basically be able to do a good job. And we almost surely won't need economists, or not very many of them, and I will get to spend my day in the coffee shop, although with no baristas there. But
thank you. We have time for questions from the audience. I think we have people with microphones. Where are the microphones? Good. This lady over here. And just while we're getting ready there, I can, Jeff, invite you to come to the Turing Institute, where we have a kind of automated barista machine, which you need to come and try.
All right, of course, and I suppose a pizza maker also to have with the.
Afraid not yet. We'll work on that.
All right, very good.
Professor Sachs, thank you so much for your speech. I'm a development economist, so hearing you speak is fantastic. I left development economics a long time ago and went into markets, so I have a question for you. The EU ETS system that we have in Europe, which is the emissions trading system, is one that was started quite a while ago and went through a lot of testing phases. And today is one where supply and demand is really determining it. And you said in your talk that markets cannot really solve our problems. And yet I find that if the price can go from 5 to 20, we realize that we really have a problem and maybe we will make change. So are you saying that this is not something that will help us at least address some of the emissions problems that we face today? Should we throw the market out completely and rely on politicians?
Right. So the ETS is an example of a great British invention by A.C. Pigou in the 1920s of corrective pricing. And Pigou was a great economist who said if you have externalities, you need to adjust the market prices to give the right signals. And in the case of climate change, the predominant wrong signal is the free disposal of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So we should tax CO2 emissions at, quote, the social cost of carbon. And that's a good policy. But it is completely insufficient to actually solve the climate change problem because of a few things. One, it doesn't answer many issues like, well, should we have nuclear power or not? That is not a kind of problem that's going to be solved by a price on carbon. But it is a very big question, say, for Britain, and a very immediate question for Britain or for Germany, which has rejected that. A price on carbon cannot solve the problems of putting a monopolized distribution system in place. So Germany used something like emissions trading. It used feed-in tariff to get a lot of wind turbines built. But then a couple of the Länder objected to overhead transmission lines, and so the wind turbines are disconnected from the German grid. And a grid is not a market, it's a plan. A grid is a structure that is not optimally built by market forces because it's what economists call a natural monopoly. So the problem with climate change is that there are a host of reasons why markets by themselves are insufficient. I have nothing against, in fact, I'm in favor of a price on carbon, though I wouldn't do a trading system. That's just an extremely overly complicated, administratively burdensome, annoying way to do this. A better way to do it would just be to announce a sequence of taxes out into the future. But that's what technically we would call a support to the equilibrium that we want. And what I mean by that is we should start from a different premise. Not that we're going to see where supply and demand emanates, but rather how are we going to end CO2 emissions by 2050? That's the real question. We have to do that, otherwise we're going to blow every safe limit on temperature rise. So we know where we want to be. And the question is, how do we get there? And we know a lot of things how to get there. All our electricity has to be generated by zero carbon sources. We know for a lot of reasons that we need smart distribution systems to do that. We know that we have to be driving zero-emission vehicles, probably electric vehicles, possibly hydrogen vehicles for larger vehicles. We know we don't yet have a great solution for aviation fuel or for ocean shipping, which are not insignificant parts of the story, but we have some sight lines of synthetics or other kinds of energy solutions for those sectors. We know a lot about that, and we should rationally plan for that. Putting in a price support, good. It will make it easier for utilities to plan. It allows for some measure of decentralization. But what we're not doing is just rationally planning what should be a zero-carbon grid. I was in Beijing a few days ago at a project in Beijing, Chinese government project called GuideCo, which I strongly recommend. It stands for Global Energy Interconnection, Cooperation, and Development Organization. And it is the China State Grid proposing to connect the high-quality renewable energy sites around the world, the Sahel of Africa and the wind of North Africa and the hydropower of the Congo Basin and so forth, into a globally connected grid connected by high voltage direct current lines for long distance transmission and a lot of smart distribution options when it gets distributed to final users. That's actually a really good idea. We would get to a zero carbon energy system in about 30 years. And I'm not saying they have every piece of the design right. There are a lot of things to test and to question, but it's a conceptualization of the solution rather than thinking that we're going to set a price and see what happens. And the way that we've been doing it now is not really leading to the solutions we want. It's been very, very slow. We're way behind the curve. We've lost incredibly valuable time, and we're not solving the problems of German lignite and transmission lines and connecting North Africa to Europe with the wind and solar and all the things we know we need to do, we're not doing. So I think you have to augment the market with some deeper planning solutions as well.
Speaking of valuable time, we've only got a few minutes left because unfortunately Jeff is going to have to take off to head to the airport. Maybe we take 2 questions and then try to give 2 more responses.
Good. Ask short, easy questions.
Do you want to pick your questions? How about the gentleman down here? And
there's somebody with the box already.
Look behind you.
Oh, you're going to throw it. Here, turn around, catch the...
Look behind you. And do we have...
Okay. Yes.
And over here.
Just speak into it.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so I'll try and keep this as concise as possible. As a geography student, one thing I think about a lot is that if markets as entities themselves aren't, because of their inherent characteristics, going to facilitate this kind of sustainable dematerialization that we need, in society at the moment, then is the happiness index our kind of best shot, our best chance at kind of communicating to that broader public the cognitive change that we need to develop sustainably?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, by the way, I like markets, just in context. I like mixed economies where there are markets, where there is civil society, where there's government, and where one understands the relative capacities of these different parts of our sociology to direct resources in the ways that we want to direct them. But the question about what would guide us is really a good question. I mean, a very deep question. I'm writing a book about this now, which I call Aristotelian Economics. That's not the title, but it is the concept. And the idea is that in a market system, it's supposed to be an open, self-organizing system, and the invisible hand is supposed to allocate resources, and allocate resources for what? For whatever tastes people have. And so in economics, you actually, basically the first day of economics, you're told people have a preference function or a utility function. They maximize that. Where does that come from? It's just there. Okay. And the idea is that a market system directs resources towards people's tastes. This is highly problematic because people don't have a utility function this way, and it's not stable, and it is a part of our life course to evolve and actually to make choices if we're made self-aware of the implications of our choices. And Aristotle said that when we think about such issues, either on an individual level, as he wrote about in his Ethics, or at a social level, as he wrote about in the Politics, we should think about what is for the good, for thriving of individuals. And it was the classic idea of moralists and ethicists and philosophers and religious types for basically more than 2,000 years that's not an easy question, what flourishing is, and it's not something that people know, and it's certainly not whatever their preference is, and that you actually have to cultivate a good life, build virtue, build cooperation, learn to be decent, to learn to behave in a socially acceptable manner, which is good for a society, and that the goal of all of this is what Aristotle called eudaimonia, which we have a hard time translating exactly. The simplest translation is happiness. A usual conventional translation is thriving. Sometimes it's just called virtue, although arete in Greek is the formal word for virtue. But the idea is that we have to learn to thrive, and we have to cultivate the human skills and our capacities for thriving, and we have to not follow our blind impulses. Well, okay, that's a long answer to the question, what should guide society? Is it just market forces? Well, for a lot of reasons, no. It's not going to, in fact, so perversely, it's not even leading us to survival necessarily, which is weird. We're not even good enough now to know to stop before we destroy the earth. That's pretty strange. That doesn't meet the market test, I would say. Or it meets the market test, but it doesn't meet the basic test of a social system that's working very well. So I do believe we need to step back and ask in a much more intelligent way, what is it that we want out of life? And there's a lot of evidence of that, and this world happiness data, which is actually, in this particular case, is based on an annual survey that Gallup International gives a lot of interesting information. And what do we actually want? We do want to escape drudgery and poverty, no question. And higher incomes are good, but so are strong social relations, so are strong social networks, so is health, so is honesty in governance, so is freedom to make life choices. There are a number of things that show up as causal explanations of these differences of outcomes. And one thing we've learned in our advanced affluent societies is that we're vulnerable to countless addictions, and we've also created an economy designed to addict us. So I often think in my next life, I want to run an addictive business of some sort where people line up at the door. And of course, that's what the tobacco industry disastrously did. That's what the fast food industry quite disastrously did. And even before there was behavioral economics, the PR industry understood quite well how to push all our hot buttons and get us addicted to various kinds of things, which is what economists would say is fine, but it's a disaster, obviously. Okay, that's a long answer and a very meandering one, to the point that we have to think, and we have the opportunity with affluence to think a lot more clearly, what is it we want out of all of this? And how unlikely it is that a, quote, self-regulating market is going to actually lead us to those answers. And the happiness measurements give us some clues, and a lot of other things give us a lot of clues to what we ought to be doing and how we ought to be using our prefrontal cortexes more effectively and our amygdalas under a little bit more control than we're allowed to do, so that we can actually think through these issues better.
Another time, it would be great to talk about addiction and social media, things like that. But can you take one last question?
Absolutely, I can. Yeah.
Great.
One thing I really wanted to ask you about in regards to distribution of wealth and this age of digitization we're entering is the idea of the blockchain, both for distribution of wealth and currency, or in the case that Sandy Pentland and similar thinkers have explored in terms of the distribution of information and, by extension, power, with having public access to the decisions made by large public and private bodies as a form of international public record.
Thanks a lot. So the question is about blockchain, and I think by extension cryptocurrencies or blockchain as an information decentralization mechanism. There's one basic principle of economics that I subscribe to, which is that money, meaning what we actually use for transactions and store value, is not a big deal compared to the real economy, and you can rarely solve something through some kind of monetary trick. So I used to be a monetary economist for a living and spent a lot of time stopping hyperinflations and other phenomena, or watching countries introduce new currencies and so on. The truth is you don't get much out of, I mean, it's good to stop hyperinflations, but there's little that you can accomplish socially by inventing a new cryptocurrency. Bitcoin will solve no problems that our national currencies don't basically address already. And for the last 40 years of my life as an economist, I've heard more crazy schemes about how a new money will do this or that, and they're usually really odd, often invented by Argentines who have done more to money than any other country in the world. They have ruined their money in more creative ways than any other country in history. And they accomplish nothing out of all of these constant monetary maneuvers. So I'm not a fan of cryptocurrencies for a lot of reasons. I've written a little bit about them. If you look on the website, you can find a couple of skeptical articles of mine. Blockchain is a completely different thing because blockchain is a very clever public ledger system that I don't fully understand in its technical features, but is the idea of creating a decentralized running account of all relevant transactions in a way that does not depend on a centralized bookkeeper that has trust. My guess is that there will be lots of applications for that. And that will be and especially when it comes in an app that even I can understand and use, so that you just download, maybe it already exists in 20 forms, that you don't really have to understand anything else, but you can set up your blockchain easily on your phone and get it going. I'm sure that there will be uses for that, no doubt, because there is a need for traceability, for measuring transactions, for keeping ledgers, and so forth. Of course, I know also that Bitcoin is a little bit crazy in this because it's gotten the world mining, which means emitting lots of CO2 emissions for no useful purpose, rather than generating a hell of a lot of random numbers. And that is a really bad use of our time and our atmosphere and our energy supplies. So proof of work, if Bitcoin depends on proof of work, if blockchain depends on proof of work in this way, it's not really as great a discovery as we think. But a blockchain that is pretty robust, that doesn't depend on buying up a lot of energy and a lot of fancy servers to do a lot of heavy-duty calculations, probably would be a very good thing. But I'm not the ultimate expert on this. I'm just a consumer of this. But I would say I am closer to being an expert on the cryptocurrency issue. And I've yet to see over 40 years a monetary trick that was really decisive for the real economy. I still prefer a national currency or a shared currency like the euro, properly managed by